All right, here's a narrative poem, kind of in the spirit of, say, the cremation of Sam McGee or whatever. This is inspired by a true story about a sheepherder that was committed to warm springs back in the day. Maybe, probably shouldn't have been, but there was a time when that was considered the solution for those with learning disabilities who lived a different way, I guess. So, based on a true story, this is what I wrote down. It's called Rosebud Bob. It was a cold, clear night in Dillon as the stars glowed by the millions on the shadow of a massive man lying flat upon his back. His hat pulled down to hide his eyes. You could smell the apple pie moonshine and the one-eyed healer mutt guarding that brown paper sack. I sat there on the cold steel bench donated by the Rotarians for the J.C. Beaver Jamboree in 1982. The old-timers say that in those days the man could lift a bale of hay and toss it like a beanbag on the Hotel Metlin roof. 'Cause the sheep were fat and the hats were big and the trees today were only twigs and the open range was the great domain of the big Basque buckaroos. As the Santa Fe goes rolling by, there's a glimmer in those emerald eyes and a memory that he'll try to hide of the lost world of his youth. So in the Beaver Head, if you got a job I wouldn't call Rosebud Bob, he might leave you with a half a dozen torque screws hanging loose. But if you got a little time and you're hanging round the knotty pine, well, the tales they tell are way too wild to not be the truth. 'Cause when you're green and 17, those uptown girls are kind of mean to the big Basque boys and their Great Pyrenees and their mob of woolly ewes. But Linda Jean was always keen on the green-eyed giant in worn-out jeans, just strolling down Bannock Street and grinning like a fool. With a ram under each big arm, he'd wade through the loading yard, parting the sea of sheep like he was Moses walking through. The giant of the Beaver Head would turn a certain shade of red when he'd see her smiling at him from the rail of the loading chutes. But seasons change and hard times came and they closed down half the grazing range to the Uscati who'd laid their claim since the spring of 72. The feds say it was overgrazed, but everyone knows that minerals came first in the eyes of the men in the three-piece suits. So in the Beaver Head, if you've got a job I wouldn't call Rosebud Bob, you might find him staring at a chainsaw buried halfway in the spruce. But way back in the woolly days before the stone-cold whiskey haze, there was not a better working man walking in a pair of boots. When the family lost their Targhee herd, Bob went looking for more work. He became a legend in the railroad world with hands like catcher's mitts. He didn't fit in the work truck cab, so he'd just ride around in back. The snow would fall and he would laugh 'cause he couldn't speak a lick. From her office in the Stockman Bank to a quiet river bank, they'd wear out the daylight when his depot shift was through. On a tan merino fleece, they'd sit there and feed the geese, and LJ would read cowboy poetry to the goofy giant mute. He slept up there beneath the stars out beyond the highway sign. LJ would give him rides as he whistled aimless tunes. He'd climb out of that old step side and she'd smile and wave goodbye, and he'd turn the color of the sunsets on the far tobacco roots. But in those days it wasn't strange to try and hide the folks away who weren't born the normal way or couldn't read and write. No one knows who called the law, but they rounded up old Rosebud Bob and shipped him up to Deer Lodge on a moonlit summer night. So in the Beaver Head, if you got a job I wouldn't call Rosebud Bob, that merle-colored cattle dog'll chew right through your shoe. He'll take your pay and wander off and try and buy a bit of grog, and it's probably not hard to blame him when you know what he's been through. 'Cause 20 years they came and went as he loitered in that loony bin with the cripples and the crazies at the Warm Springs Institute. Some blame the 90s budget cuts, some say that they just gave up, but without a single sorry bud, they just turned him loose, and the world had changed while he was gone, though he was still big and strong. The world had long ago moved on, and Linda Jean had too. Out there by the interstate, there's a rose growing through a cattle grate and a marker that reads Linda Jean 51 to 92. So he sits up there in Depot Park in the cold and lonely dark, just looking up at the stars and the lonesome yellow moon. As another train goes chugging by, there's a glimmer in those emerald eyes and a memory that he'll try to hide from the lost world of his youth. So in the Beaverhead, if you got a job, I wouldn't call Rosebud Bob. He might leave you with a half a dozen torque screws hanging loose. But if you've got a little time and you're hanging round in the knotty pine, well, the tales they tell are way too wild to not be the truth. That there was my poem, Rosebud Bob. Thanks for listening to it. I got a whole bunch more spoken word stuff coming up, as well as a bunch of new music because, well, I like doing it. So thanks for listening.